Hey, welcome back. This is part two of the chapter one lecture on foundations of communication. I think we left off at communication settings, but there was a technical glitch, and so I'm having to redo this video over. So if I stopped at the wrong or restarted at the wrong place, I apologize. So what are communication settings? Well, you can have several types of settings, and they vary from most intimate, just you, to larger group, which would be mass communication. So interpersonal is in self communication. These are things like self-talk or talking to ourselves or our thoughts. It's communication that just occurs with yourself. Interpersonal is communication that occurs with two people with a previous relationship, and it is informal. So if you had a conversation with your boss, it's two people possibly with a previous relationship, but it's formal, so it's not interpersonal communication, it's something else. But if you're hanging out with your friend, then that's an informal relationship, two people with a previous relationship, so it would be interpersonal. Small group typically is 3 to 20 people who are working together. Even if you're just talking to your boss, that does tend to bleed more into small group than interpersonal because it's more professional. But you might think about the difference between hanging out with your friend and doing a presentation for a class. You're going to behave differently in those two settings. Public communication is information that's presented to a group of 20 or more people. So a class is a good example of public communication, and you approach public communication differently than you say do interpersonal communication. If I'm talking to 30 people about essay writing, I'm going to gear it toward what I think the majority in that room needs to know, more than what I think any one student needs to know, because it's not fair to the other 29 students if I'm only speaking to one of them. And mass communication is communication that is transmitted and meant to be consumed by a very large group of people. So you might think about an advertisement on TV, or you might think about like a presidential debate. Those would both be examples of mass communication because they're meant to go to a very large segment of the population. The communication process involves a complex set of 3 different and interrelated activities, and we're just going to look at different terms from things that we actually talked about earlier. So it starts with message production, which is the creation or encoding of a message, and then you move to message interpretation, which is the same as the decoding that we talked about back on page 5. Interaction coordination is a fancy term for feedback, the behavioral adjustments that are made based on the interpretation of previous messages. So let's say you're talking to a friend, and we already did the friend example, so you can go back to the previous one for the previous video lecture for the more examples on how the creating and decoding and feedback happens. But once you give feedback to someone, of course, the process doesn't end there, right? They respond to it by creating a new message that you then have to interpret, and you'll probably provide feedback on. So the whole process just keeps starting over, and sometimes you'll decode a previous message and encode a new one before there's time to provide feedback. So they're not necessarily linear. They don't necessarily always occur in this order either. Channels are how messages are transmitted. They can be verbal, nonverbal, or visual images. So a verbal channel would be something that's spoken. I'm talking to you right now. Nonverbal channels are things like body language. There's not words to go with them, but there still are messages being encoded, and you still do need to decode them. And visual images occur when a message is being transmitted but does not actually include words or body language. So let's say you're looking at an advertisement and it's a picture with some words on it. Well, you can still get a message from that, right? The advertiser still wants you to buy their stuff, but there's not any speech happening. There's not any body language happening. So that visual image is another channel by which information can be transmitted. Media richness refers to the type and amount of information that can be transmitted through a particular channel. So what kind of information are you getting? How much information can you get from that source? And synchronicity is the degree to which participants can respond to each other in real time. So a conversation that you're having with a friend would be synchronous. They say something, you respond, they respond to you, it's a back and forth. Asynchronous is something like what I'm doing right now. I'm putting this communication up. I'm going to put it up on YouTube, and then next week, more than likely, you'll review it. And then maybe you'll get back with me and say something about it. Maybe you won't, but any communication between us, there's a significant time lag between when the communication actually occurred and when you respond to it. Emails tend to be asynchronous, and direct messages tend to be synchronous. If you log on for a tutoring session and the tutor is on the other side of the screen talking right then and there, even if you're not in the same place, if you're responding to each other at the same time, that's synchronous. If you drop your essay off, they review it, the tutor gives it back to you, and then you apply the feedback without that conversation happening between the two of you, then that's asynchronous. Interference or noise, this does not just mean things you hear in your ear. It's any stimulus that interferes with creating shared meaning. So it can be physical. So let's say you're in a parking lot and you and a friend are talking, you just gotten some groceries. And as your friend says something, a car drives by really loudly and just honks their horn. And you have to look over to your friend and go, "I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you." That would be an example of interference. Interference doesn't have to be physical. It can also be psychological. Psychological interference is, I'm sorry, my computer's being weird. Psychological interference is when maybe you're distracted or you're not all there, you're not mentally present. So let's say your significant other has come home and they're talking about the day they had at work. And to be honest, it sounds like every other day that they've had at work that you've heard. But you have a really big test coming up the next day. And you're distracted by that test, so you're not really paying attention to what your significant other is saying. That would be an example of psychological interference. It's any thoughts, feelings, or internal distractions that get in the way of creating shared meaning. So what are some of the characteristics of communication? How do we know that communication is communication? Well, it is purposeful. Intentional or not, there's always a purpose to communication, even if we don't fully know what that purpose is when we're creating it, even if it's an implied purpose. You've probably been afraid, looking back on a conversation, that your body language may have come off the wrong way. Well, there was still purpose in that, even if you weren't fully aware that you were creating that purpose. It's continuous. You're always creating or interpreting messages. If you're awake, there's a message probably being created or interpreted. Even if you're laying in bed in the middle of the night, you can't sleep, and you're going over that to-do list you have for the next day, you're still creating a message for yourself, and you're still sitting there and thinking about, kind of going back and forth in your head, okay, how am I going to organize those things? That's still creating and interpreting messages, even if there's not someone else there to interpret what you've said. So it is always happening. It is absolutely continuous. It is irreversible. You can't erase communication that has occurred. So let's say you send an email and an hour later you realize that you didn't want to say that and you hit unsend. The other person could still have seen it. And if they saw it, then the communication has occurred, even if you erase the email that had the initial communication in it. You can't undo what's been said. You can't unsay something that's already been said or written. It's situated, meaning it occurs in a specific situation. Those contexts that we talked about earlier, like whether you're in a professional environment or a personal one, or whether you have a previous relationship with the person. They're indexical. And indexical means that they are used to measure, to index a relationship. So you'll behave differently with someone that you're close to than with someone that you don't know very well or are very uncomfortable with. So what are some purposes of communication? Well, we use it to develop and maintain a sense of self, to meet social or physical needs, to develop and maintain relationships with others, to exchange information, and to influence others. And I feel like most of those are pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about them. Indexing and feedback. How we communicate is an index of how we feel about a relationship at that moment. So let's say you're with someone you really, really don't like. Well, you're more than likely, even without realizing it, going to turn your body away from that person because you want to get out of there as fast as you can. Conversely, let's say you're with your significant other, you've had a great date, and you're feeling really close to them. Well, you're probably going to turn your body toward the person and look at them more because you're feeling closer to them. So how we communicate verbally and non-verbally indicates how we feel about any given relationship at any given moment. And it can be things like body language, nonverbal cues, word choices, or which selected scripts or canned plans you use. If you're meeting someone for the first time in a professional environment pre-COVID, you might go up to them and say, "Hello, my name is," and shake their hand. That would be weird if you were at your best friend's house. Instead, you're probably going to be like, "Hey, how you doing? What's new?" It's going to be very different than in that professional environment because the way we communicate tells the other person how we feel about them. And communication can signal levels of trust, intimacy, and control. So trust is the extent, and I apologize for the typos on this one, the extent to which the partners believe they can rely, depend, or have faith on a partner in terms of communication. So will this person keep your secrets? Will this person come and help you when you need it if you're asking for help? Control is the extent to which the individuals believe they are in charge of the interaction or relationship. And complementary feedback shows agreement about who is in control, whereas symmetrical feedback shows disagreement about the level of control. So let's say you have a boss. You really like the boss, you respect the boss, and they say, "Hey, can you go take care of this for me?" You're probably going to be like, "Sure." But let's say it's a boss you really don't like and you don't respect them. They've been, a real jerk to you in the past. And they come up and go, "Hey, I asked you to do this yesterday." And you're probably going to respond with, "Well, I didn't get to it because," and get defensive. Because you don't agree about the level of control in the relationship. So the first one with the good boss would be an example of complementary feedback. The second one with the bad boss would be an example of symmetrical feedback. Intimacy is the degree of emotional closeness in a relationship. So it's how close you feel to that other person. And it is influenced, of course, by trust and control. And in turn, trust, intimacy affects trust and trust and control affect intimacy. They're all interrelated. Some additional characteristics of communication: it varies depending on the level of conscious thought. So if you are deliberately saying something to a person, it's going to be very different than if you accidentally, give them the side eye. The level of conscious thought affects how we communicate. It can be spontaneous, based on a script, or carefully constructed. So spontaneous would be no preparation whatsoever, it just happens. Based on a script would be those canned plans we talked about, and carefully constructed might be something like a pre-written speech. It is also guided by cultural norms, by which I mean perceptions, patterns of thoughts, word, accent, nonverbal behaviors, or any context that indicates what is accepted or not accepted by a given culture. We are going to stop here before this time's out, and we'll pick back up with communication ethics as soon